Ed Santow, Future Tech and How to Make It Accessible.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with all of you. I'd like to start by acknowledging the fact that we're meeting on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and on behalf of the Human Rights Commission, I pay tribute to their elders past, present and emerging. It's a great pleasure to be with you all today. Unquestionably, this is the highlight of my week. It's been quite a long week and quite a difficult week in some respects, and it's such a pleasure for me to be here with all of you who know a great deal about accessibility and indeed about new technologies. So I'm going to be speaking more with you, hopefully, than at you. And we'll have some time for some questions and comments before I wrap up. So behind me there are some PowerPoint slides, and I just wanted to mention for anyone who has vision impairment or is blind, I will describe any pictures or read any important words that are on those slides. So I'm really excited about the prospect that new technologies such as artificial intelligence can improve our lives. It can do all kinds of positive things. These new technologies can foster economic development, they can create new jobs, they can also make our communities more inclusive. There are a range of opportunities for AI and other new technologies literally to improve the lives of everyone, and including within that people with disability. I know that you know that there is a but coming, and there is. It's kind of my melancholy duty as Human Rights Commissioner not solely to focus on those really positive things. They are real, but for every one of those positive examples, there's a counterexample of how new technologies can be used in ways that actually have the opposite to those positive effects, that can shut people out, can make our communities more exclusive, and the disadvantages are not evenly shared across the community. In other words, people with disability and others who may already face difficulties in accessing services, etc., more likely to face the downsides of new technologies. So before I get too negative, and I am going to get very negative, I want to start by just expanding on a couple of positive things. And I'm doing this for a reason which hopefully will be apparent. So on the slide behind me, you'll see a couple of pictures. The first is a picture of a self-driving car. The second is one of the two market-leading in-home assistants. This particular one is the one put out by Google. These sorts of products are changing the world, which is exactly the rhetoric that tech companies use all the time. We've heard at the Human Rights Commission, particularly from disability groups, how those sorts of products can improve life. So self-driving cars in an obvious way for people who are unable to drive a regular car, that can allow people to be more autonomous. We've also heard that some of the in-home assistants can also be used while they perhaps weren't designed deliberately to be useful for people with disability. We have heard how there are ways in which they can be used to improve lives. So I acknowledge all of that. My frustration with this list, and there's always a list that looks a bit like this, is that too often we hear that there's almost some kind of, it's like a balanced investment portfolio. So for every negative example, and I'll give plenty of negative examples today, advocates, particularly from the tech industry, will say, but look at all of these wonderful things happening. So I acknowledge that these things that are positive are indeed positive, but it doesn't work in a legal way or just in a common sense moral way to say, well, It's okay to violate some people's human rights because we are also doing these good things. We need to be much more sophisticated than that. We need to say it's great when technology is used in a positive way to make our communities more inclusive, but that in no way justifies counterexamples where technologies are used in ways that disadvantage people, and especially people with disability. So I'm going to particularly focus on artificial intelligence. And I want to note that the term artificial intelligence, or AI, is not a term of art. It's a much more general term like modern medicine. So it means different things to different people. And so when I use this term AI, I want to just drill down a little bit to explain what I mean. I do this with a little bit of trepidation because I'm very conscious that there are some of Australia's leading experts on AI in this very room. And so for those of you who fall into that description, feel free to make a list of all of the mistakes that I'm about to make. And I've been scouring the world to start with a description or an explanation of AI that is as innocuous as possible, because as I've foreshadowed a couple of times already, I am going to go dark quite quickly. So the example that I'm going to give is actually, because I think it's an illustrative example of how AI and specifically machine learning can work. The example I'm going to give is from the world of art. So I've just put up an interesting artwork behind me. The human who is associated with this artwork is a woman by the name of Anna Riedler. She's a Dutch artist. And the artwork is a series of tulips, or pictures of tulips. The interesting thing about this artwork is what Anna did was that she taught an AI-powered computer to first recognise what a tulip is. And then she said, go out and create me some new tulips. And so the picture behind me is about 25 or so pictures of tulips that have been developed using AI. So the question is, how does this technology work? How does this machine learning and AI work? How can it develop this particular piece of art? And the answer to that question, as I say, is important because the technique that I'm about to describe is a very, very, very common technique in AI, and it can create things that are innocuous, like art, or indeed benign, but it can also create things that are much more problematic. So there are two particular aspects that I really want to focus in on. So the way in which AI and machine learning works is you start with what's known as a training data set. So in Anna's case, she first had to teach the AI-powered computer what is a tulip. And the way you do that is you feed it lots and lots of pictures of tulips. So on the slide behind me now, you'll see literally a small cross-section of photographs of tulip. That's the main part of the slide. I'll get to the second part of the slide in a moment. So literally what she did was she gathered together as many photographs as she could possibly find of tulips. And then underneath each tulip there is a label, and the label is a description of what's in the photograph. So it will say tulip, it will say the particular genus of tulip, the particular type of tulip, and it will also give the colour of the tulip. So there are a couple of aspects to this process that I particularly want to highlight because they are weak points in the process. The first is in the data that you feed into the AI-powered computer. In other words, what I described before as the training data. So if you put tulips into the AI-powered computer. In other words, if you teach the computer what is a tulip, you're actually making some selection. So in Anna's case, she only used tulips from the Northern Hemisphere. She is, after all, a Dutch artist. and she happened only to source photographs of tulips from the Northern Hemisphere. So she didn't include in her data set any tulips, for example, developed here in Australia. And that's interesting because it only provides a limited kind of source of what constitutes a tulip. But it can go a little bit further than that. So I know almost nothing about flowers, so I'm not even sure that I would be confident in labelling a tulip. I can go as far as saying this is a flower, but I could easily, if trying to create a data set of tulips, I could easily throw in a rose or a gerbera or a whole bunch of other things. And that's a mistake that can go in any data set, and as we've seen already, that's actually a really common problem. It can go much wilder than that as well. You could have someone who thinks it's funny or is actually trying to trick the computer, and you can throw in things that are nothing like a tulip. You could put an elephant in there or anything like that. But the point is that the AI learns from whatever that information that it's trained on. And so either through error or through mischief, you can trick it into thinking that other things are, in this case, tulips. So that's the first weak point. The second weak point is in the labelling process. And that's really, really interesting. So as I said, the labels say tulip or the subgenus of tulip, that sort of thing. But it also includes some other information that on its face seems to be factual, but isn't necessarily wholly factual, right? So one of the things that the labels include is the colour of the tulip, right? And so for me, as someone who has reasonably good vision, I think, well, okay, colour is just an objective fact. But I asked my wife, who has both strong views about colour, but also happens to be colourblind, to do a test this morning. And I asked her, what was the colour of my shirt? And she came up with a really interesting answer. She said my shirt is green. I don't think that there's any green on my shirt. But nevertheless, it reminded me that people's views about colour can be actually really quite subjective. And so with these particular photos behind me, the most obvious colour you can see in those tulips is white. But there's also a range of other colours that people with good vision can see as well, like cream, pink, and so on. My point being that there is an element of subjectivity in any of that labelling process. And I'm about to finish with the science, but it's really, really important to understand this. That subjectivity, that the person doing the labels is able to imprint on those labels, is then picked up by the computer. And so when, as we started, you ask an AI-powered computer to throw you up some new pictures of tulip, all of that subjectivity that I described, the way in which you choose the tulips that went into the data set or the labels for those tulips, all of those things will become the thinking process of the artificial intelligence. And that is where things can go terribly wrong. So that was my innocuous example. Let's talk about the way in which this very same technology, image recognition technology, can be used on people. The most common term for this is facial recognition technology. So I'm sure all of you are aware that facial recognition technology is all the rage at the moment. There's a piece of draft legislation currently before the federal parliament that would enable the legal framework for mass surveillance in Australia for the very first time, using technologies like facial recognition, among others. And that's really fascinating. We at the Human Rights Commission have been very concerned about that bill, and that bill is currently the subject of some strong criticism by the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament. There's a range of other bills, including in the New South Wales Parliament right now, that are also about facial recognition. So let's think about how facial recognition can be used in a context where the stakes are really high. So the image behind me now is an image of facial recognition technology being used in China. China is perhaps the most enthusiastic adopter of facial recognition technology, and in particular, it is used to support what is known as the social credit scheme, or it's actually a series of schemes run throughout China. Now, I'm not going to focus in on that social credit scheme. I'm happy to answer any questions that people have about it. It's a particularly dystopian vision about how a society might use a technology like facial recognition. But I actually want to focus on how facial recognition is being used in countries like our own. And perhaps one of the most interesting examples was a trial, or in fact there were two trials used recently of facial recognition in the United Kingdom by police services in the United Kingdom. Perhaps the more famous or infamous example is the one that was used by the London Metropolitan Police. So perhaps the most famous police force in the world, arguably the first ever police force. What they decided to do was to use facial recognition technology to identify people who were suspected of committing crimes. Now, remember what I started with. The way in which facial recognition technology works is exactly the same technique as the one I described with Anna Riedler's tulips. So it starts by training the AI on a large data set of faces, of photos of faces, what are known as headshot photos, right? So you train that AI with as many photographs as possible, and then over time, the idea is that the AI learns how to recognise people and ultimately will be able to identify people. So that was the piece of technology that was used to try and identify a number of people in the UK who were suspected of committing crimes. And it was a real situation. It wasn't a test. So the outcome of this trial is really interesting. There's some good news and there's some bad news. I'll start with the good news. The good news is that the London Metropolitan Police came up with 104 matches. In other words, 104 people that were suspected of committing crimes. They were able to use facial recognition to identify those people, which is extraordinary. There's bad news as well. The bad news is that of those 104 matches, 102 of them were wrong. In other words, it had a failure rate of about 98%.
Missed it by that much.
Exactly. That's exactly what Maxwell Smart would have said. So the graph behind me is simply showing that 102 of those matches were false positives and only 2 of them were correct. So the people who were wheeled out to explain these figures for the London Metropolitan Police had quite a nifty way of explaining it. So they said 2 things. First, they said, yes, there were 102 errors, but the 2 people that were correctly identified were people that we were actually looking for. And so let's focus more on those 2 people rather than on the 102 errors. Just draw breath at that. And then the second thing they said, which is really interesting, and that's the one I really want to focus on. They said, yes, there were 102 errors, but in due course, we realised they were errors. And then we discarded them. So I'm a human rights lawyer. When I hear words like in due course in that kind of context, all of my kind of lawyerly antennae start pricking up because terrible things can happen in that period that is airily described as in due course. In other words, the period between when you make an error and when you realise you've made an error in a policing context can be catastrophic because the individual in question can be arrested unlawfully, they can be detained unlawfully, they can have a range of other coercive action taken against them. And that, for me, is really, really worrisome. So let me be really clear about this technology in 2019. It is far, far less accurate than the state of the art. In other words, it's far less accurate than the ability of humans who can see to recognise other people. Now, we know that people are not very good at recognising or identifying other people they don't know. But let me also be clear, contra to all of the US cop shows that I like watching and that perhaps some of you like watching, this technology is far less accurate than us as humans. The other thing that I wanted to draw out is that the inaccuracy is not evenly spread across the community. And that's a really, really important problem. So there's a very interesting piece of research done out of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the United States, and it's called the Gender Shades Research. It's led by this amazing researcher by the name of Joy Buolamwini. If you're interested in her or if you're interested in the research, just Google gender shades, because she's a fantastic communicator. So what she did was she said, well, we know that facial recognition technology is not particularly accurate, but is it more accurate on some people in the community than others? And she was particularly interested in whether it was more accurate in respect of people basically who look like me, white, middle-aged men. And the short answer is yes, and the difference is incredibly striking. So she and her team decided to set a relatively easy task. She knew that the facial recognition technology, the market-leading facial recognition technology, just isn't very good at identifying people. So she set it a much, much easier task and just said, okay, is this headshot a male or a female? So in most cases, you have a 50-50 chance of getting it right. So it's not saying, tell us who it is, just tell us, is it a male or is it a female? So most of the market-leading facial recognition technology is reasonably accurate. It's up to 99% accurate in identifying whether a white middle-aged man is male or female, right? But if the person happens to have dark skin, it suddenly becomes wildly inaccurate. If, for example, it is a dark-skinned woman, then it will only correctly identify their gender in 3 out of every 4 photos. In other words, 1 in every 4 photos, it will think that a woman is a man. And when you think about that, we as humans very, very rarely misgender someone. In other words, think that a woman is a man or a man is a woman. So it's wildly inaccurate, but that inaccuracy is particularly clustered around people who have darker skin. Well, that was the focus of the Gender Shades research. What other research has shown is that other parts of our community who are not white, middle-aged men like me are also less likely to have that technology work accurately on them. So there was an interesting piece of research done by Sherry Byrne-Haber, and I've just got a small picture from a piece that she wrote on medium.com, where she was particularly focused on the inaccuracy of facial recognition technology for people with disability. So much like people with darker skin, people with disability are more likely, in fact, incredibly more likely to suffer the inaccuracy of facial recognition as compared with people who don't have a disability. So the picture I have behind me shows 2 headshots of the same woman. One was taken before she had a particular piece of surgery, and the other was taken after she had a particular piece of surgery. And the facial recognition, the market-leading facial recognition technology just can't basically discern that is the same person, in short. And so what worries me about much of the technology associated with AI is first that we have perhaps been kind of willing to suspend our disbelief. In other words, that yes, it's improving really quickly, but in some areas it is still far less accurate than the state of the art, right? Far less accurate than conventional technology. When there is inaccuracy, secondly, when there is inaccuracy, that it is especially people of colour, people with disability and other groups who have to wear the consequences of that inaccuracy. And that thirdly, when this sort of technology is used in situations where the stakes are really high, in other words, in human rights terms, where people's human rights could be violated in ways that will be hugely harmful for individuals, that this technology can often be used without proper checks or balances or protections. And that, again, for me, is deeply, deeply worrisome. So before I start getting towards solutions, I wanted to drill down a little bit more at looking at accessibility issues. So the next slide I've put up is a slide that is drawn from the Microsoft website. They're Seeing AI part of their website. And I know a number of you, perhaps most of you, will be familiar with the work of Microsoft and other technology companies to use the same sort of technology that I've just described to make our communities more inclusive. That's a good thing. Again, I wanted to emphasise that because I realise I'm focusing on a lot of negatives, but these sorts of application are used, this particular sort of application is used by people who are blind or have a vision impairment. There are 3 pictures on the screen behind me. The first is of a person who is blind who's holding up his phone, and it is describing some of the things around him. The second is of a person holding up their phone to identify a friend that the person is having lunch with. And then the third photo is someone holding up their phone over a piece of text so that the text can be read out to the person who's blind or has a vision impairment. Now, I recognise all of those things are really positive uses, and I also recognise that in each of those situations, usually, not always, but usually, the stakes will be relatively low. So if a minor error is made, you'll be able to correct the error without any negative consequences. I mean, it obviously depends on what you're reading, and it depends on who you're identifying, but on the whole, that's a really important thing to acknowledge. In other words, the context is really, really important. But as I say, none of those positive uses of AI, including in the facial or visual recognition field, justify when those things are used in a way that I would say is harmful or cavalier or is not sufficiently focused on what are some of the risks that might actually lead to human rights violations. So going straight to some of those risks, a number of you will be aware of a problem that arose in the Commonwealth Bank's Albert machine. So the Albert machine is a point of sale device where if you are paying for something by credit card, you can do tap and go, but if you're buying something that is over a certain amount of money, you have to type in your PIN. So the Albert machine, and there's a picture of it behind me, is what's known as pin-on-glass technology, and as I can tell, many of you are aware of that problem. So pin-on-glass technology, in principle, cannot be accessed by people who are blind or have a vision impairment, obviously. But we also know that for many years, you can have pin-on-glass technology that is designed really cleverly so that it is accessible for the range of the community, the full range of the community. That didn't happen with the Commonwealth Bank's device. The other picture on that slide behind me is a number of smartphones that are also pin-on-glass, but that do use the more inclusive design techniques that mean that people who are blind or have a vision impairment can still use the relevant smartphone in a way that is accessible to them. So I guess, again, it's a reminder to us that design really matters. And so when we at the Human Rights Commission have focused on how we make technology work for people better, work for the full gamut of our community, and specifically when we focus on ensuring that new technologies are accessible, we are especially focused on human rights by design. Now, there are a lot of terms actually now that have sprung up that all operate in a similar line of country. So there's human rights by design. In the disability field, there's universal or inclusive design that is often used. In a related field, in privacy, they talk about privacy by design. When we talk about human rights by design, we're trying to talk about it in as broad a way as possible. So I want to acknowledge just very quickly that there are a number of people in this room that are really not just Australia-leading experts, but world-leading experts on some of these issues, in particular the Digital Gap Initiative, and I can see there's some representatives from the Digital Gap Initiative here with us today doing some fantastic work on this, and it's really, really important. And there are, I guess, there's a lot that can be learned from that. So what we will shortly be releasing a major discussion paper on human rights and technology. And one of the things we've tried to do in that discussion paper that you'll all be able to read very soon is to think quite deeply about how we can apply these design-led principles, what we are calling human rights by design, to the way in which new technologies are developed and used from the get-go. And what is critically important is that you start at the very earliest stage of the process. So the second last slide, which is on the screen behind me, is just an illustration of how design thinking is starting to develop and be applied in this context. And there are 5 particular words that are used there. You start by, well, this is the ACC online version. The verb that they use is empathise. In other words, you bring together a very broad cross-section of people in the early stages of the research and development process, including people who are users who may not look exactly like me, white middle-aged men, but may be people with disability, various types of disability, and other people from the community, and you actually value their experience, and that is critically important. That Intopia has, I think, been at the forefront of this as well, in saying it's not just enough to have people in the room, you actually need to make sure that those people have a distinct role that is valued and that is critical to the establishment of whatever it is that you're trying to do, if it's a new product or service or whatever. The next step is to define really clearly what you're trying to do. That sounds obvious, but perhaps is not as obvious as it needs to be. So defining what you're trying to do means being really, really clear on what the use case is, what you're trying to achieve, who you're trying to reach, and so on. The third stage is described as ideating. I hate that word. I don't know how that noun became a verb, but anyway, it did, and forget my pedantry. The ideation process that is being described here is, for us, really important because what it allows you to do is think about how a whole range of human rights can be engaged. So sometimes we latch onto a particular human right, be it privacy or some other human right, and we stop there. And often that's not enough. You need to think much more deeply about how a new technology product or service will engage a whole range of rights, and then thinking really deeply about how to make sure that those rights are protected and indeed advanced. The fourth stage is prototyping. And that's a really important stage because there's a kind of a very strong, I'm trying to find a neutral way of describing this, a very strong trend in the technology industry to use what's known as the MVP, or minimum viable product approach, where you simply go, okay, we've done the first 2 or 3 things really, really quickly, and then we'll get a product and we'll put it out there, and that's it, right? And we'll just test that product on our customers. That can work where the stakes are really low, but it can also lock out a whole range of parts of our community in ways that are often, frankly, unlawful and are certainly very poor process. So that step of setting up a prototype, or maybe even a series of prototypes, so you can really test some of your ideas, is critically important. And that brings me to the 5th stage in this design thinking process, which is testing. Now, again, that should be really, really obvious, but with, if I can be a little bit kind of critical, the kind of fetishization of the minimum viable product approach. Often you don't have that testing in a safe environment. You're literally testing new products and services on people, and that can be actually really harmful. So we really want to put wind in the sails of the work of a number of people. We're certainly not at the forefront of this, who have been thought leaders on design thinking. And the very last thing I would say before I wrap up is that we've been working on this project for the last year and a half. So we put out 2 documents. There's a picture of each of them behind me. The first was an issues paper which we released last year, which basically asked a whole series of questions about human rights and tech. And the second was a white paper which we put out with the World Economic Forum that was much narrower, looking at leadership and governance in relation to artificial intelligence. We have a website, tech.humanrights.gov.au, where you can sign up to updates for our project. And we would really, really like, for when our discussion paper comes out very soon, that people take a look at it, and that you let us know what your thoughts are, because we'll be finalising our thinking in 2020, and then we'll be moving to implement all of those recommendations for reform. So that's it from me. I'm in your hands about whether we still have any time for questions or whether I need to wrap up.
Thank you so much, Ed. So Ed does have to leave directly after the presentation, so we would love to open up for questions. Lots of very eager hands.
Hey, Ed.
Hi.
There's this Einstein quote that's probably not an Einstein quote about technological process is like a psychopath with an axe. And the way I kind of interpret that is that if you give someone a tool, for good or bad, they're going to use it regardless. What's the reception like with governments when you're talking about some of these tools like AI and their desire to pursue it versus some of the concerns that you raise?
It's a really, really great question. So I think up until a couple of years ago, we hadn't properly turned our mind as a community to the risks and threats of harm, but that is starting to change. And so our community, our citizens, or if you must call them our consumers, are increasingly aware of what's at stake, the sorts of things that I'm talking about now. So what I think our government is starting to wake up to is something really positive, which is that there's a choice. Either we can go down a path where anything goes, this is unregulated space, that people's rights will not be protected. But if we do go down that path, we're not giving citizens what they want. Or we can innovate in ways that are consistent with our national values. We are not a perfect country, obviously, but we are a country that takes really seriously concepts like fairness and equality. We're a liberal democracy. Those liberal democratic values are built into the architecture of our system. I think it's the right thing to do, to make sure that we build and develop technology products that are consistent with those values. But I also think it's smart. I think it's in our enlightened self-interest to become known as a country that builds and develops and uses products, including AI products, that bake in the sort of protections that I'm talking about that will protect us against harm and that will actually help us to advance our human rights. But that's a choice, right? We're not. I mean, last thing I'd say about that is we're a middle power country. You know, we're not going to be able to compete on scale with countries like the United States or China. But what we can do, and what we've been able to show that we've been able to do in a range of different areas, is we can compete on particular niches. And I think one of our niches is our liberal democratic values. I think that people, just as people are willing to pay more for a car if it's shown to be safer or more valuable in some way, people will pay more for an AI-powered product if you can show that it is going to protect you, that it's going to take really seriously your human rights.
Hi, Edward. It's Gary Austin. I was wondering if the Human Rights Commission have any plans on the horizon to update the advisory notes on the 1992 Disability Discrimination Act, in particular in focus to ICT, given the change in technology in the past 8-9 years since it was published?
Yeah, so it's my colleague, Ben Gauntlett, Dr. Ben Gauntlett, who's the Disability Discrimination Commissioner, so he has a responsibility for that. But we've been working really, really closely with Ben on this, so I don't want to kind of steal my own thunder by saying what our proposals will be, that will be coming out very soon. We're thinking about that, and we're also thinking about whether there's a new standard under the Disability Discrimination Act that might be needed that specifically deals with some of these technology issues. And so we'll have more to say on that very soon.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Hi Ed, I'm Emma. I was just wondering where we're able to get more information about the facial recognition bill in Australia.
Yeah, so the bill is called, there are two bills, but the main bill is called the Identity Matching Services Bill. It was introduced into Parliament last year. We did a really detailed submission because the bill's quite complex, and we did a really detailed submission, if I remember it was about 50 or 60 pages, that kind of walked through how the bill works and what some of the risks are. That's on our website. It's also on the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security website, the PJCIS website. And then we did a follow-up submission where we tried to be brief, which for me as a lawyer is like the hardest possible thing. So we then put a kind of a supplementary submission, which was basically about 4 or 5 pages, which is my version of brief. And that basically sort of it updated some of our concerns based on some more recent research, especially relating to facial recognition. And I had to admit it's more plain English than our really, really long submission as well. I should say that the PJCIS has now put out its report, so that's the Parliamentary Committee's kind of take on the bill and its concerns.
Thank you, Ed. Any further questions? Well, thank you so much, Ed. That has been both enlightening and a very important topic.
Cheers. Thank you.